I saw the thing coming out of the sky. It had one long horn and a one big eye.
Welcome, folks. We are starting our third unit in biology on cells and organelles. What we're going to get into now is the first part of our notes on that, and we'll cover cell theory and cell types.
We're going to orient ourselves here first. Last unit, we talked about the hierarchy of matter and how we've got these smaller pieces coming together to make larger pieces, larger pieces, larger pieces. So just to reiterate that, we've got atoms coming together to form molecules, form these larger molecules, the macromolecules, which form organelles, and then cells and tissues, organs, organ system, organism. We are focusing on a couple of the levels here with this unit, the organelle and cell level. Maybe a little bit of tissue might be in there too, but primarily organelles, the little organs inside of cells, and then cells themselves.
So just a little refresher from our very first unit when we learned about the characteristics of life. And we said all things that are alive kind of have to do these 8 things, maybe not our total 8 down there, but cells have to kind of carry out all of these functions as well. So again, they need to be able to reproduce, they need to grow and develop, they need to take in materials and energy, respond to their environment, maintain that stable internal environment or homeostasis, change over time as a group or our evolution that we'll learn about later on. And they have specialized components that kind of help them accomplish all of these things. So this unit will get into kind of what are all those specialized components that help cells be alive.
So a little bit of history on cells and where the term cell comes from. So back in 1665, just a few brief years ago, an English gentleman by the name of Robert Hooke was playing with some of the earlier types of microscopes, which were basically just fancy magnifying glasses stacked on top of each other. And he was looking at cork underneath his simple microscope right here. The cool thing about cork is it's got really big cell structures with heavy cell walls. So it was easy for him to see that basic structure under his primitive microscope. And when he looked at that, he thought it looked kind of like this. This is an old monastery.
That's exactly what I thought when I saw this picture of cork.
Well, at this time in England, this is just after, the Tudors and Henry VIII and the Reformation, and England knocked down a lot of the old monasteries. And so walking around the countryside, you see a lot of these. And these little rooms here in the monastery next to each other were the monks' cells, or their bedrooms, but they called them cells. So since this looked kind of like those rows of monks' bedrooms, which are called cells, stuck together, he decided to call them cells, and that's why we call them cells.
So cell theory, we've got 3 simple premises that set up the foundation for what we now call cell theory. To you, it's probably going to sound silly, like, of course, duh, all of this makes sense. But you have to remember, this was kind of a revolutionary idea back in the day before people knew that cells existed, that we were made out of cells. So here, they're basically, the 3 parts to cell theory are, all living things are made of at least one cell or more than one cell. So you can be that unicellular or multicellular organism, but in order to be a living thing, you have to be at least one cell. The second part was that all living cells come from pre-existing cells by division. So where did your cells come from? Well, you started off as a single cell at one point in your life, and that cell divided into 2, into 4, into 8. My math is not working here. So those cells, the cells that made up you, came from that original cell. Where did that original cell that was you came from? Well, you might not want to think about it too much, but it came from mom and dad. And where did those cells came from? They came from their mom and dad and all the way back. So cells come from pre-existing cells. And then the final bit here is that the cell is the fundamental unit of structure and function for living things. So Ms. Ripley was talking about before how cells can carry out all the functions that living things do. That ties in with this part of cell theory here, that the cell is able to accomplish reproduction, maintaining a homeostasis, and all the other responding to stimuli, all the other parts of the characteristics of living things. Again, too, and I'm going to talk and make this a little bit longer. Your students are going to hate it, and they're just going to be like, "That's
curse you, Demeter."
I know, lightning is going to come down and just strike me. But just to put this into context, okay, the idea that all living things are made out of cells. Maybe that's new to you, but likely that's not like a mind-blowing thing. But there was a huge debate as to whether or not that all living things were made out of cells. And so as microscopes became all the rage across the world and people were looking at things, some people were looking at plants and animals and fungi and all sorts of things, like everyone noticed, okay, everything we look at that's living is made out of cells. And that's where part of the definition for living things comes from, right? You have to have at least one cell. And then cells coming from pre-existing cells, I can't not mention the theory of spontaneous generation, which was the idea that cells could come spontaneously into existence from random inanimate objects in the environment, right? A pile of garbage would spontaneously give rise to maggots and flies and mice because people didn't see that, flies were laying eggs, microscopic eggs on the garbage, and then that would grow into maggots. And so to them, it seemed like, oh my gosh, living things just spring into existence out of nowhere. You and I, we know better. We know cell theory because we live in the 21st century. And that's, I guess, all I got to say about that.
All right, so we covered this a little bit at the beginning of the semester, these things called prokaryotes and eukaryotes, but we're going to go into a little bit more detail now because we're going to be thinking about the organelles or the things inside of cells for this unit. So prokaryotes, remember, are cells that don't have a nucleus or other membrane-bound organelles. So again, we said that these are kind of the simpler cells. They don't have these fancy things with all these membranes and everything else. And that their genetic material then is free in the cytoplasm. So our genetic material, again, like DNA, RNA, it's just kind of floating around in the cell. It's not really kind of contained in one little spot. It's just there in the cell somewhere. And finally, they don't have chloroplasts, mitochondria, the endoplasmic reticulum, or the Golgi body, which are things you're going to learn about subsequently later in some of our lessons here. So if you don't know what those are just yet, that's okay. But basically, again, our prokaryotes are a little bit, again, simpler. They don't have quite as many of these organelles that we see in eukaryotes. And again, our examples of things that were prokaryotes when we were talking about the different kingdoms of life, typically our prokaryotes are unicellular, they're smaller, and mostly it's like our bacteria, right? A lot of bacteria are prokaryotes because they're that single cell, and they don't, again, have like that nucleus or any of those organelles inside them.
In this unit, we're going to focus mainly on eukaryotes or eukaryotic cells. And like we said before, you are eukaryotic. You have a nucleus.
And you can prevent forest. Okay, sorry.
Forest leaves falling. You can't. That happens with nature. Anyway, but you have a nucleus and you have a membrane-bound organelles like the Golgi and the endoplasmic reticulum and the nucleus. Okay. Our genetic material, our DNA, is, and all eukaryotic DNA, is held safely inside the nucleus, right here in the middle of the cell. Keeps it safe, keeps it organized, keeps it from getting as easily damaged as it was just floating out here randomly amongst all the other riffraff of the cell.
It's the VIP lounge of the cell.
There you go. I don't know what those look like. I've never been in one. Can you tell by the way I'm dressed? Anyway,
I thought this was the VIP lounge. Where am I?
So our cells, eukaryotic cells, have mitochondria and chloroplasts in plants, endoplasmic reticulum and Golgi bodies, like Miss Ripley said. Example, basically everything other than bacteria. Protists, the protist kingdom, the fungus kingdom, the plant kingdom, the animal kingdom, everything but the Monaran kingdoms or bacteria is a eukaryotic cell. And just to kind of point out some of the differences, what's one problem with this model? If you're looking at this, guys, what's something that kind of strikes you as like, that's not right? Mr. Kemeter?
Eukaryotic cells aren't purple.
Some are.
Well, if you're, what is it, a something, something, something purple people eater, whatever the song is.
It was a one-eyed, one-horned, blind purple people eater. One-eyed, one-horned, blind purple people eater. One-eyed, one-horned, blind purple people eater. Sure looks strange to me.
Anyway, it's a size problem. It's a size problem. There's something wrong with the size of these cells. One of them, well, I guess they've corrected for this, so they've shown us here. There is a scale shown at the bottom. The eukaryotic cell, the one, yeah, the purple one there, is much, much larger than the prokaryotic cell. So they're showing it in a larger view, I should say. They're showing the prokaryotic cell in a larger view, just so that we can see the detail. It's not showing us the relative size.
You've got it, yeah. It's showing us the detail. This prokaryotic cell, this bacterium here, is really about the size of one of these mitochondria that's inside the eukaryotic cell, to give you an idea on the scale difference here. We can see this prokaryotic cell, the DNA is just kind of random. There's a few ribosomes, and there's not much else going on inside there. It's pretty simple. We look at this much bigger eukaryotic cell. We've got our nucleus with the DNA. We've got all sorts of other organelles and things going on, much more complex, much more sophisticated.
Higher degree of organization.
Yep, but no less alive than the prokaryotic cell.
Plant versus animal cells. So eukaryotic versus prokaryotic cells is one distinction we want you to be able to make. The plant cells versus animal cells is another distinction we want you to be able to make. And that's because there are lots of similarities, but there are some fundamental differences between the two types as well. So there are a few additional structures in plant cells that we want you to know. The first is the cell wall. It's a really thick, rigid structure around the outside of the cell. It's the outermost layer. It's kind of like a shell around the cell. Do you have something you're going to show us, Mr. Hamele?
Same. Mr. Hamele always has the best stuff.
We don't have time for you to play balloon tricks right now.
When I say that,
excuse you.
Balloon, because it's kind of like the cell membrane that all cells have, and then all the cell stuff is inside that, right? Our cells look like this. They're kind of squishy. But a plant cell is kind of like this balloon. I'm playing dangerous here.
Yeah, that's I'm a little worried.
In the back of my mind, I'm like, fall. I want to hear a smashing sound.
But we've got this hard outer shell around the cell membrane, provides some structure and support. So this is the cell membrane, which all cells have, and this is the cell wall, which plant cells have, and technically fungus do, and so do some protists, but animals don't.
And so that's the first big distinction. And you'll be looking at these underneath the microscope later on. That is one of the biggest differences that you're going to see between plant and animal cells. Another big difference, and the reason that some plant cells are green, because if I say plant cells are green, Mr. Hamele is going to say that's not all plant cells. And he's right, because that's a distinction we also want to make later on. Anyway, plant cells have these, some plant cells have these organelles called chloroplasts. They are what give leaves of plants like trees their green color. They're the organelle that's responsible for capturing energy in sunlight and using that to build glucose, which we learned about in our last unit, food basically for the plant. And we, animals, don't have those. Otherwise, we'd be able to stand out in the sun and make our own food instead of eating it, right? So we don't have chloroplasts. Plant cells, some plant cells do.
Which plant cells do?
Plant cells in the parts of the plants that are responsible for making food.
There you go. So you're not going to find them in the roots.
No.
Underground.
So additional, so in plant cells, we've got a large central vacuole. I made this just now. Hamele blows up balloons. I was just whittling this in the corner while Hamele was talking. Here's our plant cell. Might as well point out the outside is the cell wall, this thick part right here. This is our nucleus. These green little bits here, those are the chloroplasts. But then the swimming pool in the middle here isn't a swimming pool. It's a large central vacuole. And plant cells use this large central vacuole for storing excess water and other materials. But that also helps provide the plant with some support. Think about this central vacuole as kind of like deflated, and that would cause the rest of the cell to be a little deflated as well. Think about the grocery store, the vegetable section, they mix the food, the veggies with water because they want the central vacuole of the veggie cells to fill up with water, which would then inflate the cell, cause it to get really swollen and rigid up against the cell wall. And that way your like broccoli leaves and celery leaves don't wilt over. So that large central vacuole not only is water storage and some material storage, but it also helps provide some support and structure for the plant as well.
Another analogy there, that it kind of acts like the inner tube in your bike tire.
Hey, that's a good one.
If your bike tire was the cell wall, the inner tube would be this vacuole, and if it's got lots of pressure, if it's full of water, it's going to push out and keep your tire nice and firm. If you don't have enough water, it kind of deflates a bit, and then the cell gets all squishy and can't hold itself up.
I like that one. Never heard that one before. Did you just make it up?
Nope.
Okay.
I think I taught that one to you years ago when you were a student teacher, but apparently
you got to listen better.
Doesn't stick.
Yeah.
What were you saying?
Exactly.
Diagram demonstrating the differences between plant and animal cells. So those are the three big ones, the ones that we'd expect you to be able to tell us or use to distinguish between plant animal cells on a test and in your daily life, because you know how that's going to happen. And we've got it's important. It's important. It's about how your body works and how other organisms work out there. I don't mean to undersell it. So on the diagram, the red outside of the cell on the left is showing us the cell wall. So already I know that that's a plant cell. And then inside we can see the green chloroplasts with their little stacked discs in there. And then we've got the large central vacuole, the big purple blue kind of blob in there. So we can see those three structures in the cell on the left. We do not see them in the cell on the right. The cell on the left is a plant cell. The cell on the right is an animal cell. Both are eukaryotic cells.
And that will conclude this section of the notes. We'll see you guys back in a little bit for the next section.
TV show, he was blowing it out, really knocking them dead, playing rock and roll music through that horn in his head.